panel is The New Face of U.S. Imperialist Wars, and it's sponsored by UNAC, the United National Anti-War Coalition. If you're not familiar with UNAC, we are the major anti-war social justice coalition in the United States today. We formed at a conference, a national conference of 800 activists in 2010, and since then we've played a leading role in challenging U.S. wars and threats of aggression through calls for action, education, and we demand out now from Afghanistan and Iraq and no intervention in Libya, North Korea, Iran, Syria, Africa, Venezuela, and now Ukraine. And an end to drone attacks in Pakistan, Yemen, and Afghanistan, and Somalia, and everywhere. In 2012, we initiated the organizing of the opposition to NATO that was meeting in Chicago, and we had the largest anti-war demonstration since earlier in the Iraq War, where 15,000 rallied and marched, the last major mobilization of the anti-war movement in this country. We're also active in the social justice movements, civil liberties, and climate change movements. To get our mailings and action alerts, be sure to sign up. And organizations are invited to affiliate with UNAC. We're today in a new phase of imperialist wars. In the past, the U.S. was involved in maybe 1 or 2 wars at a time, and warfare was of the more traditional type of boots on the ground. Vietnam was a real turning point regarding the U.S. population's huge opposition to an ongoing war. And in spite of 9/11 and the massive propaganda campaign to justify war in Iraq, millions took to the streets to oppose it, an unprecedented event. The American people have grown increasingly weary of wars, seeing no justification to the huge costs of lives lost, countries destroyed, cuts to social services, economic downturn, and the increasing militarization of the domestic police. We saw with the huge negative response to the threat of military intervention in Syria that Washington can't sell this today. So now there's a turn to covert action, to drone warfare, special operation forces in Africa, 800 plus US bases around the world, billions to NGOs to engineer regime change, massive payments to strategic country allies and proxies like Israel, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, and support to right-wing forces everywhere. They claim they are pulling out of the Middle East and talking about a pivot to Asia. But the reality is that under the radar and global surveillance, they are pivoting everywhere. And the cartoon, I do urge you to take a look at it. I think it's classic and perfect for describing what's going on, the new reality. The face of the 21st century imperialist wars is everywhere. The technologies of the 21st century also now allows unprecedented global surveillance, even from space, in a new form of war, cyber warfare. This can seem daunting, but we have reason for optimism. Things we see change very quickly, and when people are pushed too far, they will act and unleash their incredible power. We need to be ready for that time, and our discussion today is how we can respond to this new face of the old imperialist agenda of profits above all. The first speaker is Abayomi Azikiwe. He's the editor of the Pan-African Newswire. He is the co-founder of the Detroit Coalition Against Police Brutality and the Michigan Emergency Committee Against War and Injustice, and a member of the UNAC Administrative Committee.
Thank you so much. Indeed, it's always a pleasure and an honor to participate in the Left Forum. And I live in the city of Detroit, of course, which is also undergoing a form of counterinsurgency as we speak. Perhaps we can talk about that a little bit later during the question and answer period. My topic deals with the Africa in the current phase of the imperialist war drive. And perhaps the most overlooked aspect of the militarist policies of the United States and the European Union as well is the growing intervention of these former colonial and currently neo-colonial states in the internal affairs of the African continent. Since 2008, both the United States and the European Union member countries have been heavily involved in the region under the guise of fighting a so-called, quote, war on terrorism, unquote. Now, according to the narrative advanced by the ruling elites in the imperialist states, Africa is a major source of, quote, international terrorism, end quote. And that if the West does not intervene to monitor and to track down these elements, they will eventually attack the U.S., as was done on September the 11th of 2001. These same arguments were also put forward in the beginning of the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan and the lead up to the intervention in Iraq. Afghanistan, of course, almost 13 years ago, and Iraq, of course, in 2003, some 11 years ago. Now, with specific reference to the war against Afghanistan, the U.S. and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization forces have been occupying this Central Asian country directly for nearly 13 years. Moreover, if we examine the origins of the war in Afghanistan, it can be traced back at least until 1979, when the Soviet troops entered the country to defend the socialist government that had come to power the previous year. Now, the Al-Qaeda network was actually encouraged and facilitated by the United States, beginning under the Carter administration, 1979 and 1980, and thereafter by two successive Reagan terms between 1981 and 1989, and eventually the one term of rule of George H.W. Bush between 1989 and 1993. It was the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, and the Pentagon that provided training, weapons, funds, and diplomatic cover to the so-called Mujahideen in Afghanistan to counter the influence of the government that was in power at that time in Afghanistan under the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan. Now, after the collapse of the Camacaro sector in the Soviet Union between the late 1980s and 1991, the much touted, quote, end of the Cold War, unquote, was actually a myth. There was of course, new enemies for imperialism to target, challenge as well as defeat. In 1990 and 1991, there was the massive military buildup in the Persian Gulf. And of course, in response to the Iraqi annexation of Kuwait, the Kuwait monarchy, the massive aerial bombardments and ground invasion of 1991 in Kuwait and in Iraq led to an ongoing series of military operations against this Middle Eastern state. The utilization of sanctions, the continued presence of the Pentagon warships and fighter aircraft led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqis. 12 years after the first Gulf War, the George W. Bush administration, after occupying Afghanistan, then went into Iraq despite massive public opposition inside the United States and around the world. Now, even though the allegations that were made by the Bush administration suggesting a direct link and even an alliance between Al-Qaeda and the ruling at that time Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party of Iraq was absolutely absurd to anybody who knew anything about the politics of the Middle East. There was still a concerted attempt to sell this to the public here in the United States. This false linkage served as an underpinning for the fake weapons of mass destruction fabrications that were promoted not only by the Bush administration, but were picked up and publicized by the corporate media, including the New York Times, and the then, quote, pre-liberal, unquote, MSNBC television network, which also supported the Iraq War in 2003. Now, a review of these arguments enunciated by the ruling class to justify war in the Middle East and in Central Asia are strikingly similar to what is being said today about the current situation on the African continent. One major exception, however, is the greater utilization of national and regional governmental troops as surrogates in these imperialist interventions. Now, I wanted to talk about some specific examples of imperialist intervention in various African states that have gotten a lot of attention over the last several months. Now, over the last several weeks, first of all, I just want to talk about Nigeria and the Central African Republic. Over the last several weeks, events in the West African state of Nigeria, which is Africa's most populous state, has drawn the attention of people throughout the world. The abductions of over 200 female high school students in the village of Chibok in the Borno state in the northeast of the country even prompted the intervention of the First Lady, Michelle Obama, several weeks ago. Nonetheless, the war between the Federal Republic of Nigeria and Boko Haram has been raging for nearly 5 years when the Nigerian military and the police stormed the headquarters of the sect and killed its founder, Muhammad Yusuf, and dozens of his followers in 2009. Now, since that time period, the tactics of Boko Haram have become more deadly every year. In 2011, the organization was said to have been behind the bombing of the United Nations headquarters in the political capital of Abuja in Nigeria. Christian churches have been bombed in the northern and central regions of the country. Security personnel are being murdered more frequently, and improvised explosive devices are being planted, even in the political capital of Abuja, that have resulted in the deaths of dozens of people over the last few months. Now, the character of the corporate media coverage of the Nigerian crisis conceals the strategic alliance between the country and the United States ruling class. Nigeria is the largest exporter of oil from Africa into the United States. That's a very important point for us to take cognizance of. The character of the corporate, the recent announcements have been made that the rebasing of key indices by the Western financial publications and institutions has resulted in Nigeria being designated as a leading economy on the African continent. It just came out several weeks ago. Now they're saying that the Federal Republic of Nigeria has the largest economy in Africa, that it has surpassed the Republic of South Africa, which previously had the largest economy on the continent. At the same time, as the country is being championed for its tremendous investment-led economic growth, both France and the United States are moving its intelligence and military apparatuses into the country to battle the so-called Boko Haram insurgency. Now, earlier in the year, when the Nigerian government was commemorating the centenary of the consolidation of British colonial rule over the country, which took place in 1914, the French president, Francois Hollande, attended the events surrounding the 100-year anniversary. Hollande pledged to assist Nigeria in the so-called fight against terrorism, and then traveled to the Central African Republic, which is a former French colony, now undergoing the greatest internal security crisis during the post-colonial period of its history. The Central African Republic is also a country that contains strategic resources that are of interest to multinational mining corporations from both Western Europe as well as North America. A rebel coalition led by elements within the minority Muslim population, which only constitutes about 15% of the overall number of people in the Central African Republic, took control of the country in March of 2013 and held it until January of 2014, when the government of interim President Michel Jotadaya was forced to resign, largely at the aegis of Paris. Once the Selega coalition was forced from power after a regional conference held in neighboring Chad, a Christian-based anti-Balaka militia group went into action attacking Muslim-owned businesses, mosques, and neighborhoods. By April, tens of thousands of Muslims had been forced to leave the Central African Republic for what was perceived to be safer areas in neighboring Chad and Cameroon, both of which have a history of French colonialism. Now, France has sent at least 2,000 of its own troops to the Central African Republic. The occupation is being supported and facilitated by the Pentagon. People may not be aware of that. They've been flying in troops. They've been providing equipment. They have also been involved in the initial stages of the intervention. Also, special forces from the United States have been operating in the Central African Republic at least since 2011, when the Obama administration deployed military personnel in pursuit of Joseph Kony, the leader of the Lord's Resistance Army that was founded in the East African state of Uganda many years ago. The imposition of another Christian-based government in the Central African Republic under interim President Catherine Samba Panza has not created the conditions for normalization inside the country. Although hundreds of thousands of Muslims have been forced into internally displaced camps and also into exile in neighboring states, at present there is a resurgent Muslim resistance movement that has also surfaced inside the country. They've been carrying out attacks over the last few days. In addition to the enhanced intervention of France and the United States, the European Union forces, EUFOR, have also entered the country in the aftermath of an EU-Africa summit that was held in April in Brussels, Belgium. Now, this summit generated tremendous controversy in Africa, since it deliberately bypassed the African Union, the regional 54-member African Continental Organization that was the successor to the Organization of African Unity that was formed some 51 years ago, and extended or denied invitations to individual states and leaders in direct contravention to the African Union's Peace and Security Council. So the AU has its own Peace and Security Council. They had set up conditions for participation in this European Union Africa Summit, and the EU totally disregarded the Peace and Security Council and decided who they were going to invite and under what conditions. Now, troops from several African states are operating as well inside the Central African Republic. The African troop presence is mandated by both the Regional Economic Community of Central African States, the CEMAC, as well as the United Nations Security Council. Moreover, the United Nations Security Council several months ago approved the deployment of some 12,000 foreign troops also to be sent into the Central African Republic. Their mandate appears to be designed as a peacekeeping force which is allowed to engage in military operations ostensibly geared towards stabilizing this troubled state. In these various foreign military forces, if these various foreign military forces are added up, they will constitute an occupying presence of at least 20,000 foreign troops in the Central African Republic. The degree of U.S. presence in the CAR cannot be fully determined in light of the role of special forces and Air Force units that are providing logistical and intelligence support for the French, EU, and CEMAC, as well as UN deployments. So this gives you an idea of when we hear reports about the Central African Republic, they don't talk about the mineral wealth of the country. They don't talk about the ongoing French presence there, and also the African states that are allied with France, as well as the presence of the European Union, as well as the United Nations Security Council peacekeeping force, which I said will number up to 12,000. So anyway, we can stop there, and perhaps later during the question and answer period, we could talk about South Sudan and other regions on the continent that are a focus of US, EU, Pentagon, as well as Israeli intervention. Thank you so much.
Our next speaker is Bernadette Ellorin. She's the current chairperson of the U.S. chapter of Bagong Alan Sang BAYAN, or BAYAN USA, an alliance of 18 Filipino-American organizations fighting for genuine sovereignty, peace, and democracy in the Philippines, as well as the rights and welfare of Filipinos in the United States and the entire diaspora. Bernadette is also a member of the UNAC Administrative Committee.
Thank you. I'm going to share a little bit more about the so-called U.S. pivot to Asia. Just to start off, why Asia Pacific in general? Why is it an area of interest? Just to give more background, the Asia Pacific region is the largest market for U.S. exports. It's worth about almost 1 trillion U.S. exports. It's the largest supply of cheap labor in terms of migrant labor. 60% of the world's population is in the Asia Pacific region, and it's also a source of oil. Particularly in the South China Sea, you see large deposits of oil and other natural resources. So back in 2010, the Obama administration embarked on a new free trade agreement negotiation, and this is called the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. The TPP, how many people have heard of the TPP? It's slated to be the largest free trade agreement in history, much larger than NAFTA. And its scope is actually beyond trade. It actually has major implications on U.S. foreign policy and militarism. So that being said, so right now the TPP is being negotiated within 12 countries in secret, largely in secret. And WikiLeaks was able to disclose one chapter in the negotiations. And to give you an idea of how threatening it is in terms of civil liberties. The chapter that was leaked talked about investment rights, investor rights. So basically, multinational corporations, if they feel that one country is not giving them the right to invest freely, they can sue. They can sue the country. So that just gives you an idea of how egregious it is and how for-profit it is. So in 2010, that's when this negotiation started. In 2011, Hillary Clinton, the then Secretary Hillary Clinton, announced in an op-ed in Foreign Policy magazine, the op-ed was called America's Pacific Century, that America was going to be looking towards the Pacific in terms of its diplomatic thrusts. And since then, you will see, many Hillary Clinton, John Kerry, even Obama himself going to the Asia-Pacific region to have talks with various leaders in the region. And then in 2012, in January 2012, Obama and then Defense Secretary Leon Panetta at the Pentagon announced that they would be shifting the focus of their military might from the Middle East to the Asia-Pacific region. So you see this gradual shifting. They call it a pivot, but it's not a pivot. The pivot is a very deceitful term to use because actually the Asia-Pacific region is home to the largest regional command of the U.S. Armed Forces, the U.S. Pacific Command. And its area of scope is over 36 countries. And it's in charge of all of the bases in the region and all of the defense treaties in the region. So it's not a pivot. It's an escalation of geopolitical strategy. Actually, the U.S. has been in the region since 1898 with the Philippine-American War. So they've been in the Philippines for 116 years. So the role of U.S. bases, first of all, U.S. bases is a low-cost intervention. It's a low-cost intervention for the imperialists because they don't have to wage an all-out declarative war. They just have to have, and it's a very much a low-intensity conflict. So the U.S. has been intervening in the Asia-Pacific region for decades, and in the form of military bases, in the form of counterinsurgency, in the form of military aid for proxy armies, and all of these things are at play where I'm from in the Philippines. The military aid, the proxy armies, the counterinsurgency, and the base. So the role of bases, of course, is not ever for defense. It's never for defense. The role of a base is to control the shipping lanes of commerce and trade. And in that area of the world, most of the major shipping lanes for commerce and trade are there, especially along the South China Sea. So that's the reason why they're escalating their presence in the region right now. They just signed a new access agreement with the Philippine government, which would basically open up all of the Philippines to become one virtual U.S. military base. And they're heightening their exercises with different countries, particularly in Korea, Malaysia, and Vietnam. So you see that they don't need to declare a war. They just have to increase their presence through military exercises, and this is why it's like an intervention at a discount for the U.S. imperialists. So back to the TPP. One of the strategies for the imperialists right now is to isolate China. And I want to say that in terms of the U.S.'s policy when it comes to dealing with China, right now we see a policy of two-pronged policy, one of containment and one of engagement, because the U.S. and China are very valuable and crucial trade partners to each other. But at the same time, China's race to control the free trade area of the Asia-Pacific region is threatening the U.S.'s hegemony in the region. That's why the U.S. must create a free trade agreement such as the TPP that basically isolates China economically. I don't want to say that the U.S. is ever going to wage war with China because of that trade relationship, but certainly the U.S. is trying to provoke some sort of hostility towards China, particularly with the encroachment of dealing with regional territorial disputes along the South China Sea, where China is basically encroaching on territories of other Asia-Pacific regions in that area, and the U.S. is basically fanning the flames for military provocation by engaging in military exercises in the region. So in terms of the neoliberal policy, which is another form, which is the other side of war and militarism, neoliberalism, and with the Trans-Pacific Partnership being kind of the centerpiece of this so-called pivot. What we're seeing right now is very recently, President Obama visited the Philippines as well as other Asian Pacific countries such as Japan, South Korea, and Malaysia. And we're seeing a lot of pushback in these countries against TPP. Particularly in Japan, they have not agreed on all of the stipulations of TPP. And that is a very positive sign for all of us who are fighting against US imperialism. The US imperialism is being fought on so many different fronts in the region. In the Philippines, there's a vibrant anti-imperialist movement that's on the streets and also in Congress. There's also a very vibrant revolutionary movement in the Philippines, one that is fighting, particularly waging an agrarian revolution to basically take back the land in the country from multinational corporations and from big landlords. In India, same thing. There's also an agrarian revolution happening there. In South Korea, there's a very vibrant labor movement that has been waging a national strike against neoliberal policies. And so all around the Asia-Pacific region, there are vibrant people's struggles against imperialism and, in particular, neoliberalism that was a very fruitful ground for solidarity relations with people here in the U.S. Lastly, regarding the new military agreement between the U.S. and the Philippine governments, the Filipino people kicked out the bases back in 1992, the former permanent bases, U.S. permanent bases in the country in 1992, but unfortunately the U.S. military never left, even though the bases were kicked out, because through various agreements they were able to maintain their presence, and they called it visiting presence or rotational presence, but it's not temporary presence at all. It's permanent. And so now with this new defense agreement or this access agreement, it's not a base per se, but it gives the U.S. access to all Philippine military facilities, and that's a very unequal setup, because the Philippines doesn't have a very modern military. It's a military that's very much dependent on U.S. military aid. So right now, the U.S. is changing its role from being an advisory role as a visiting force to now being able to hold operations. And in the Philippines, we are seeing drone exercises. We're seeing more and more U.S. nuclear and other types of warships coming into the country for port visits, and of course the ongoing military exercises between the U.S. and Philippine military. So I'll stop right there, and perhaps we can talk about this more in the Q&A. Thank you.
William Camacaro is a member of the Bolivarian Circle of New York, Alberto Lovera, and an expert on Venezuela because he's from Venezuela.
Yes. Thank you very much for having me. And sorry for the lateness. When in the last few months we have been facing a very sophisticated coup, continued and low-profile coup against the government of Venezuela. For the last 15 years, we have facing several different attempts of coup. And, for example, in April 2011, was a coup. The President Chávez was overthrown, and thanks to the people of Venezuela that went to the street by thousands. Some people say millions, and I really believe that millions of people were on the street. President Chávez was able to came back to power. Since that happened, the legality of the constitutional order rests on the popular insurrection, because it was a popular insurrection that took back Chávez to power. So immediately after that coup, in January, and between December and January 2003, we have the so-called oil strike against President Chavez. So they just get, they try to destroy the economy. And again, we have another popular insurrection, because people went to all these big companies of the state, the oil companies surrounding they were around those installations, and they had the list of all the people that the government said, the executives that were sabotaging the company, and they organized by themselves checkpoints, and they were requesting IDs, and if you were on the list, so people that were organized by themselves, they decide, no, you cannot go inside because the minister said that you are part of the sabotage. So again, the popular insurrection preserved the Bolivarian revolution. In December and in April 2002, I have to say that you remember that several people were killed close to the presidential office. And I have to say this, at that time, the advisor of the police department of Caracas was William Bratton. So William Bratton is now the police commissioner in the city. So William Bratton, he basically provides the training to those members of the police department that were fighting against the popular power that were defending the government in Venezuela. Again, we have to understand, I think that this is very important, that the legality of Venezuela is resting on the popular insurrection. Then we have, in 2004, May 9, we have a farmer very close to Caracas called Dactari, where the Venezuelan government catch 153 paramilitaries from Colombia, all of them from Colombia. The owner of this farm, Adolfo Alonso, is now living here in Miami. Very comfortable living in Miami. And Venezuelan government has been requesting to State Department, you know, send this guy to Venezuela, to the justice, but he's in Miami. So we see this, for all these 15 years, this happening again and again and again. The United States government trying to overthrow in one way or another one the Venezuelan government, the Bolivarian revolution. And they have been using all kinds of tactics. They have been accusing the Venezuelan government of drug trafficking. They have been accusing the Venezuelan government of supporting the guerrilla movement in Colombia, to give them money to other governments. Even they said that they gave, the Venezuelan government gave to Kirchner $300 million, something like that, in suitcases. So you can imagine how many suitcases, you know, that is. They say, oh, Chavez was financed Hezbollah, also Hamas, even the Taliban in Al-Qaeda, Chavez was financing them. And they would have headquarters in Margarita Island in Venezuela, according to the State Department. They have been also working and create a scarcity of food, sabotaging the food the distribution in Venezuela, using the bourgeoisie to do their dirty job there, and the same tactic that they used when Salvador Allende was in power. And you remember that they create a scarcity, they sabotage the economy, they try to destroy the main industry of Salvador Allende at that time, and also Even if you see the documentary, the Battle of Chile, you will see that even toilet paper, they didn't have toilet paper in Chile during Salvador Allende. So, of course, during Salvador Allende, and also in these 15 years, the Bolivarian revolution has been facing a huge media campaign. A media campaign that has been caused, that has been in certain people causing some kind of sicknesses that made them to be detached from the reality. They really don't know what the hell is going on in the country. They really think that the Taliban are somewhere, that the Al-Qaeda is around, and they believe all this stuff that United States is trying to make them to believe through the mainstream media. Before that, we have the Caracazo, that was in 1989. I have to mention this because the Caracazo, thousands of people went to the street, demonstrate, and almost more than 3,000 people were killed, and most of them were poor black people of color. In those days, those people that were demonstrating basically almost every day were poor black people, brown people, and the mainstream media was not paying attention to them. So you didn't see any single news about it in the media in those days. And the Caracazo happened, and Carlos Andrés Pérez, the president of Venezuela at that moment, was received by George Bush, the old guy, and he said basically, oh, he's a good Democrat. Okay. He killed 3,000 people, he's a good Democrat. So last year, the foreign minister, he met John Kerry in Guatemala in a summit that was taking place in Guatemala. And this summit was a summit where they met for the first time. And basically he said, oh, boys, you don't have to think more about socialism. Just, let's be the partners and let's try to make a deal. We can do very well. And then, he went to Venezuela. He said, well, John Kerry said to me, oh, you know what I said. He said that in the mainstream media, national media in Venezuela. And everybody was laughing in Venezuela. No. As you know, this administration has not recognized President Maduro as the president of Venezuela. Obama has not recognized Nicolás Maduro as the president of Venezuela. But at the same time, he has been organizing one of the most sophisticated coups in this part of in this continent, again, the Bolivarian Revolution. Again, he's doing his part for the State Department. They are using the Twitter, they are using Facebook, all the mainstream media. They are, using pictures of police brutality happening in Egypt, Ukraine, and they are using all this propaganda against the Venezuelan government. So a lot of people are getting confused about what really is happening in Venezuela. And at the same time, we have cable, and we can see Fox News in Venezuela, we can see CNN, and all of them also are lying about what's happening in Venezuela. Basically, this is a continual coup d'etat against the Bolivarian Revolution that already has more than 4 months and that will be taking place for maybe a year. This is not going to end. Right now, they say that they want to negotiate, they want to really have a good relation, commercial relation, but basically the coup, the continual coup, is going to continue. So they will maintain the process because they are expecting in any time to be able to overthrow Nicolás Maduro. But at the same time, they not overthrow Nicolás Maduro. They are expecting to erode his power for the next coming elections and to be able to organize what they did in Paraguay. That was a constitutional coup using the parliament. So I'm going to stop here. My time's over. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Jeff Mackler. He's a member also of the UNAC Administrative Committee, and he's been an anti-war leader for many years. He is the West Coast coordinator of the Lynn Stewart Defense Committee, and they did a very excellent job, and the director of Mobilization to Free Mumia Abu Jamal. He is an author of several books and pamphlets on imperialism, war, and other topics, and recently has been writing excellent articles about Ukraine.
Thank you, Marilyn. I thought my subject was Egypt. Is it Ukraine?
I'm sure you're equally articulate no matter what the
I was mistaken because I prepared a 2-hour report on Egypt. But I must be in the wrong place. But I do want to talk about Egypt before I talk about the Ukraine, because it's front page news. In fact, the elections were so important to the democratic Egyptian government that they decided to, when no one came to the polls a few days ago, to extend the voting for another day in order to give some credibility. And now the estimates are, no one in the world believes it, including UN observers and so on, that there was anything resembling a legitimate vote. Partially because they killed everybody who tried to campaign on the other side, literally tens of thousands of people. But the reason I mentioned Egypt is because the June 30th Tamarud rebellion that overthrew the elected Morsi government was said to initially have 14 million people present in this massive mobilization. They picked the number 14 because Morsi was elected with 13 million, and therefore if more than 13 million sign a petition for your removal, then you have more people on your side signing a petition and so on. But as the figures came out, it turned out there weren't 14 million, there were 40. There were 56 million people, and the numbers kept changing all the time. 56 million people were said to have signed the Tamarud petition. And that, of course, gave justification for the al-Sisi government, the military dictatorship, to simply remove the unpopular president and call it a revolution. Some, unfortunately on the left, called it the second Egyptian revolution. But what it was is an open, blatant, US-backed military coup by a military dictatorship. The same dictatorship that operated under Mubarak, minus Mubarak. But I mention the numbers because it was literally 10, 20, 30, 40, 56 million, which is, roughly speaking, the entire electorate of the entire country voted to sign the Tamarud petition. It later came out that this petition was financed and organized by the opposition parties to Morsi, by the billionaire capitalist ruling class, by the military itself, and was a fraud. And 3 days later, after the Morsi was removed from power, the dictatorship, al-Sisi, took power and began to slaughter the entire leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood, ban the party, 10 million member party, the largest in the country, and justify its existence. And Secretary of State John Kerry appropriately commented that now Egypt will have a second chance at democracy, which they are now having. So I'm saying this only to call your attention to the fact that today the new face of imperialism warns us that we must take great care in analyzing these mass mobilizations which we see around the world. Tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people mobilized in Maidan, the independence square in the Ukraine. And no doubt there were a number of them that had just grievances against the oligarch president, a former Russian oligarch, who's now Ukrainian oligarch billionaire, Yanukovych, because of the austerity program that had been implemented. In fact, Ukraine was bankrupt, and the blame was put on Yanukovych, who was said to be pro-Russian. But part of the article that we wrote in our newspaper, Socialist Action, said that this was a US imperialist coup without an army. Now, why did we say that about the Ukraine? Well, first, 80% of all foreign direct investment in the Ukraine prior to the coup was from the European Union, not from Russia. The bankers that held the debt that would have been forfeited were European Union bankers. and the association agreement that the European Union was pressing Yanukovych to sign, that he resisted, would have and has had the effect of turning the Ukraine into a Greek-like austerity program, where massive numbers of public employees would be fired, where social services would be cut, where the price of gas would be doubled, where major social services would be eliminated, and where there was a guarantee that European Union bankers would be repaid. And in the months that ensued, the $17 billion loan was increased to $30 billion, but economic analysts who I respect have pointed out that at the end of the 2-year period with the European Union loans, the Ukrainian economy will be in worse shape than ever before. It'll be a Greek-style massive situation. So this was the situation under which people protested the effects of the economy, and Yanukovych was offered a better deal with less onerous agreements by the Russians, and he said he would take it. At which point, the Maidan protests shifted, and a couple of incidents that most people in the world don't know about took place. The most important was the slaughter of Maidan protesters. I say on both sides, because there was a powerful, well-organized, armed, neo-fascist contingent. And I'm not exaggerating. Our comrades on the scene in the Ukraine had to run for their lives when they were attacked by fascist militias in the Ukraine, in Kiev, and their literature was destroyed. But in any case, here was the justification, and I say the false flag, for the storming of the Rada, which removed the Yanukovych government. Who stormed the Rada? Not the Maidan work and rank file. It was mostly a middle-class NGO-type crowd in the Maidan. But it was the armed forces of the extreme fascist right sector and the Svoboda Party, a pro-Hitler, pro-Nazi organization. The United States did not have an armed force in the Ukrainian army, so they used the pretext of the slaughter of Maidan to take over the Rada, to violate the Constitution, to set up a new government ministry with 5 top posts going to Svoboda and the right sector. And I mean top posts, I mean the Deputy Secretary of War and the Under-Deputy Secretary of War were all neo-fascists. The Minister of Agriculture, Ukraine has been the traditional breadbasket of Europe, was a pro-Nazi. And other major ministries were headed by, but you control the army, that says enough. When Catherine Ashton was caught on tape talking to the Estonian foreign minister who was on the scene, the Estonian foreign minister, who has never retracted it, nor the Estonian government, stated that, contrary to Ashton's belief, it was the right-wing neo-fascists that shot their own people in the Maidan and not Yanukovych's police. Yanukovych had to flee for his life to Russia. So it was a false flag. I just wrote a 2-page article in my paper about another false flag, which came within an inch of starting a war. How many of you have read Seymour Hersh's article on the sarin gas in Syria? Well, Hersh presented all the evidence that I needed, he's no fool, indicating that it was the Turkish government aided and abetted with the full knowledge of the United States and top American officials that used sarin gas on their own people in order to provide the false flag necessary to justify a US war, which was in preparation. I'm talking about a Libya-style war, not strategic bombing to take out a few military bases, but to destroy the infrastructure of the entire country, as the United States did in the name of humanitarian war in Egypt. Another taped, in Libya, another taped statement, which was quite interesting, was the statement of Janet Newland, who was talking to Payet, the US ambassador, and when they pointed out that the coup makers appointed the wrong prime minister of the country, Nuland said, we want Yatsenyuk, who is the prime minister, and it was quickly shifted to make sure that the U.S. interests were defended in that country. Under these circumstances, we felt that the heavy hand of U.S. imperialism could not be denied. We demanded in UNAC, U.S. out now, no U.S. intervention in the Ukraine. The United States, with NATO, has surrounded Russia to the tune and has 1,100 bases around the world, plus another 1,000 in the United States, moving on to Russia. We now have evidence there are Blackwater troops in the Ukraine because 90% of the Ukrainian army in Crimea deserted to the Russian army. Now, why the Ukraine? Why was there an interest? And I'll conclude on this. There was an interest because, among other things, Ukraine has the 4th largest shale gas reserves in the world. And the United States, which has now become the chief exporter of this gas, wanted to control those. And in fact, prior to the coup, the United States had signed agreements with the government to frack Ukraine in order to substitute American-owned oil corporations for Russia, which provides 30% of the gas of Europe, and in some countries 50% of the fossil fuels. So this was, in my view, in part, a fracking war organized and initiated by United States Corporation over the very fuel whose continued use spells doom for humankind.
Why didn't Yanukovych ask the Russians to come in the minute he knew there was a third flag?
We have a question period for that, so I just want to finish up so I don't abuse the time. Watch out for these mass mobilizations. Janet Nuland pointed out that $5 billion in U.S. funds from the CIA went to the Ukraine to NGOs in order to organize, quote, democratic protests. Just like the United States funded how many of you know the Cuban Twitter program, Zunzaneo, in order to organize flash mobs to demonstrate a democratic opposition in Cuba, which they finally had to stop and admit didn't exist. So what is the new face of imperialism? Not too different from the old. They don't send 500,000 troops like in Vietnam and kill 4 million people. But they do, they say, Obama says he's leaving Afghanistan, but half of the 100,000 troops were privatized death squad Blackwater army inside Afghanistan, and they will remain. This is a death squad U.S. policy which exists throughout Africa and virtually every nation on earth. Privatized. This is drone war, like on Pakistan, where in 37 African countries they have military stations, and they essentially say to any would-be opposition person, either you agree with the policies of the United States government militarily with our death squads, or we'll drop a drone on you and your ass is grass, if I may say. So the new face of imperialism includes flash mobs, includes cyber war, like we heard from Snowden. It includes economic penetration, like in the Ukraine, and so on. In both of these countries, and I promise this is my last conclusion, they're capitalists. Russian oligarchs are the same oligarchs that rule the Ukraine. They ripped off state property when the Soviet Union disintegrated and operate in their own interests, and they can be bought by the highest bidder. But the main focus in the Ukraine was not the Russian threat, which was simply to bail out the country at a better rate, was the organized imperialist economic infiltration backed by the only reliable military force they could, openly neo-fascist troops to storm the Rada, take over the country, and rule it with impunity. We'll say more later, and thank you very much.
Our final speaker is Sara Flounders. She's the author of War Without Victory, The Pentagon's Achilles Heel. She is the co-director of the International Action Center and a member of the Administrative Committee of UNAC, and an organizer of many past major anti-war mobilizations.
It's really an honor to be participating in this panel today with quite a number of folks that I work with over years. Now, just taking up the new phase and the new face of imperialist war, it's a challenge that we need to take on as to how to act and how to look at things in a different way, how to lead, what kind of coalitions, what kind of activities. There is a population today that in every poll, every time they do a measure or a count, war on Syria, threat in the Ukraine, doesn't matter where, is overwhelmingly, and the polls are 80%, 89%, huge, huge figures. Actually, the Wall Street Journal polls, because of the class they're speaking to, the figures are always much higher than the USA Today or the Pew polls. That's interesting too. In terms of those who oppose U.S. military action for any reason, it's a challenge for us politically how we organize in a time when there's also a systemic crisis of capitalism. We often say capitalism at a dead end. Capitalism without options, without a future for youth, with low wages and lower wages and lower wages and destruction of pensions and housing on a massive scale. Look at what Detroit is an example for what the entire country faces. And it is a crisis because this is a system that's so fabulously productive that it can't possibly hope to sell what it produces, and the only money to be made is in endless speculative bubbles. It's more ruthless also because U.S. imperialism faces a crisis in its drastically slipping position in the world. This is an empire in decline and decay, and its productive capacity has slipped from producing more than half of all the goods at the end of World War II to today. It's way down on the list, and of course, even on a large scale, China, I think, will be expected to surpass by next year. There was for a long time a Keynesian militarism. The military was used to absorb the surplus, the billions of dollars that went into the production of everything from Trident submarines to nuclear weapons that could destroy the planet many times over, at a cost of trillions and trillions of dollars, creating really the greatest dislocation in history. A couple of $1 billion could feed the world, but you know, they'd spend that in the bombing in Iraq in a few days. So, and you have today a military budget that's larger than the rest of the world combined, and it can no longer bail the U.S. out of any economic crisis. It can be $500 billion and more, and it grows every year. And yet, when the banks were in crisis, it's taken, what is it, it's past 13 trillion of direct money. So the infusions from the Pentagon are no longer enough to even solve the economic crisis. It's unrestrained war, and it's constantly trying through military means to reconquer what is lost. And that's why I say this is a challenge for us, how to answer, how to respond, how to look at the world in new ways, how to know that the population is overwhelmingly against war, and yet also passive and quiet on the questions of war. Unless they think the war is an immediate danger. What happened on the question of Syria in September was it went from picket lines to suddenly there was not a congressional office in the country, that people weren't literally banging on the door for a vote against the war. That wasn't organized by the anti-war movement. It was organized by the sudden fear that war was again a possibility. So there are things happening, that subterranean things, that it's good for us to always be consciously thinking of. What does it mean? The only solutions are not only military means in a desperate effort to reconquer what's lost, a desperate effort to grab hold of markets, to expand NATO, of competition with Germany and France and the EU, along with I'm so glad that Berna addressed the tilt, and it's not a tilt to China, to Asia, how to reconquer Russia. This is a dying system that is desperately seeking to survive and very consciously using an escalation in racism and on a global scale in ethnic and religious differences. As Abayomi described, what's happening in Africa, this is not a mistake, it's not an accident. It's part of the policy of AFRICOM in every country where they want to seize hold to use massive means of destabilization. It's exactly what they used in Yugoslavia. It's the very same policies that are used, and they have the anthropologists and the military means to know exactly where to go and how to exacerbate. There's also repression on a massive scale, both on a global scale and internally. The largest prison population in the world, it's grown by 7 and 8 times to what it was just, I think, 3 decades ago. The largest police force, the police force in New York City is larger than most countries in the world. They're the military of most countries of the world. And then, as I say, the military, you have an NSA that is spying on every internet, every letter mailed, every phone call made. So this effort to reconquer, and where that's not possible, from massive destruction. It's like the story from Goldfinger, you know, this billionaire who wanted to control all the gold of the world. And they said, well, you could never seize the gold in Fort Knox. It would take you weeks just to move it. He said, I don't want to move it. I want to nuke it. So then the supplies of gold that I have will be the only gold in the world. So that's the way the U.S. looks at markets. It's the way they also look at oil. That's the way they look. If they can't control it, take it off the market, absolutely destroy it. And that's what's happened in Iraq and in Libya until they can pump it again in their name. This is the ruthless, ruthless struggle to control markets. Now, I want to spend and they're using, whether it's drones, or in AFRICOM, a military action a day. I mean, it's huge. It's on a massive scale, and the population here can be completely overwhelmed by it, because they're also overwhelmed at the same time by the real economic problems that are greater than at any time. Now, in Syria, there is a massive effort through sanctions, through thousands and tens of thousands of mercenaries, to overthrow the government and completely also destroy and dislocate. More than a third of the population of Syria today are refugees, are dislocated. I mean, you wonder how a society even exists with that scale of dislocation, and yet the fierce feeling in the country is to resist this takeover because they look at what happened to neighboring Iraq right next door. So it has made a fierce support also for a government which there may have been all kinds of differences with in the past, but facing mercenaries of a fanatical character and death squads, the population has really rallied and has, for more than 3 years, resisted like we saw a resistance in Libya for 7 months of bombing, systematic. It was quite an incredible feat. But in Syria, it still holds, and so the question for us is how to respond. We have to know that we're up against total demonization. Whether it's Saddam Hussein in one time, or Gaddafi, or now Bashir Assad. And U.S. recognition plays an important role in this. You could look at the Ukraine, where a day after the fascist coup, Yatsenyuk is invited to the White House. The government is immediately recognized. The government that has not a shred of credibility, that overthrew an elected government. And yet, the elected government of Maduro, as William Camacaro pointed out, is not yet recognized. So political recognition is absolutely a political act coming from the White House, from the top down. Who's recognized? It's a fascist It's the reactionaries and who is not recognized. Now, how we respond, of course, we could say US out everywhere, and that's true. How we link the struggles together and also consciously take on the demonization, that's important, because responding in a combative way is important. It's not just the broadest unity, it's answering the crises as they arrive, when they're arriving. Now, I think for matters of time I won't take up, but the 4 elections in the past few weeks, where you had in the Ukraine a massive referendum, millions of people involved in East and South Ukraine, the People's Republic of Donetsk and Lugansk, calling for renationalizing the industries. There's armed people's militias. A very exciting development, really worth looking at here, and the referendum that they organized, quite an accomplishment. And then the fascists organized an election without credibility, who could run in the Ukraine. 2 elections within 2 weeks of each other. One representing a determination of the people to resist, and the other a staged and manufactured thing. And I'm so glad that Jeff described the election in Egypt, where it was probably the biggest no-show vote in world history. I mean, the number of people that stayed home in 2 days of voting, they said 10% of the population had voted. So they extended it another day, and they said there's a $70 fine to anyone who doesn't vote. And all kinds of threats of any state employee and so on. Subsidies given for voting and so on, just to turn out a vote. Now, I want to close in looking at what's happening with this election in Syria. And why it's important to pay attention to it. Hopefully everyone got this sheet and this statement on the back. But it's responding as crises happen. I don't know if anyone here has followed the news. It hasn't made much US news. But Lebanon today is absolutely paralyzed, locked down. The city of Beirut, the roads are impassable, because like more than 1 million Syrian refugees are on the move in order to vote. And there's like 1 voting place. And so the roads around, it's just quite an incredible, if you've seen the pictures, you see a sea of refugee Syrians who are coming to vote. They were so fearful of, and overwhelmingly, for Bashar Assad. Now that's important to recognize. Regardless of what we think of the political program, the determination, people see it as one way of resisting an absolute takeover by death squads and mercenaries. And that's why it's had this enormous, there's no other explanation. It could have been a stay-at-home like in Egypt. People know how to do that. But there's the opposite response, so much so. Now the US barred Syrians from voting here in New York. And there's a demonstration, by the way, today about that by the Syrian American community. There are thousands of Syrian Americans who are outraged by this. They barred Syrians from voting, something they haven't done before, in Germany and in France and in Belgium and in the United Arab Emirates, other countries where there are large Syrian populations over years and now refugee populations. They're so fearful of this response, and the election in Syria will be on Tuesday. We think it's important. From the International Action Center, we're part of a delegation. There's an important US delegation that went from a number of organizations to Syria during this time. Why? Not because we're voting, but because this is one of those resistance feelings that sometimes takes an electoral form and also can take an armed form and can take all different forms of struggle. But going to Syria, and this is also a world issue, are parliamentarians representing the great majority of the people of the world. Why do they think an election in Syria is so important? The parliamentarians from China, from Russia, from India, the BRIC countries, from Brazil, from South Africa, the ALBA countries from Venezuela and Bolivia, and countries all over, as I say, really representing the vast majority of the world population, would go to Syria to be there as election observers. It's a country at war. How can they possibly organize an election? They say, oh, the US media says has no credibility. It's a civil war. They can't possibly recognize an election. One of the most important U.S. elections was during the U.S. Civil War. That's how Abraham Lincoln was elected. So, in a more difficult time. Now, was it democratic? Not only couldn't the Southerners vote, that's fine, the slavocracy, of course there were no black voters, there were no women voters, there were no Native American voters. It was a very important vote because it was in the middle of the Civil War when the question was slavery. So there's a question of a civil war, there's a question of a huge internal war in Syria today, but it's also an outside invasion, and the people standing up to it, standing up to the mercenaries, and asserting their right as a sovereign country. And so solidarity with that is needed. And I'm going to end just by saying that we do need a movement that consciously links to the struggles here. I'm speaking in a panel on the fight for 15 later today. Consciously, how do we link the anti-war movement and the struggle of low-wage workers, McDonald's workers, Starbucks? How do we challenge the media lies? How do we refuse the demonization? Refuse, when we hear that whether it is Gaddafi in Libya or Saddam Hussein, it doesn't matter. We just draw a line and speak only on the question of intervention. We don't join in the demonization, ever. It's like in the middle of a racist attack, being there consciously agreeing with the racists. No, if there's demonization of a country or leader, we just stand back from that totally and support the country that's targeted. How do we build solidarity among ourselves? And this panel, I want to very much say that this is a work in progress, but the anti-war movement does need to look at a new phase that we're in and how we proceed differently than 30 and 40 years ago to meet a very new challenge.
Now we're going to proceed to questions and discussion. We have about a little less than a half hour. And I want to again ask that you sign our mailing list for UNAC so you can hear about all the actions that we're
Can you just pass it around?
part in. And take a look at that cartoon that I passed out, which sort of summarizes what the U.S. is doing today. You had a question?
I have two questions. The first question is, in terms of taking the scatter diagram, which is the way I look at it, of all these disparate events, is the unified theme to basically, you know, from the U.S. standpoint, and the taxpayer standpoint, is you're creating liabilities on the part of the U.S. taxpayer, tangibly and intangibly. Tangibly in terms of dollars, intangibly in terms of risk of these people coming in and taking retaliation, for an asset that is essentially privatized. So in the case of Iraq, the Iraqi national oil companies, national resources are transferred to the cronies of Cheney. In Ukraine, Biden's son and Heinz, stepson of Kerry, is getting the gas distribution system. In the case of Afghanistan, the resources associated with metals are going to affiliates of Chase. So are they privatizing the assets, creating the public liability, and then doing that all over the place? Even in the case of Syria, you're doing it for Qatar and Saudi Arabia in terms of putting the pipeline through. So is that the case?
We're going to have a bunch of questions, and then the panel will, in a wind-up, sort of answer the ones that are directed at that. I think there's no other way to.
Okay. So we have one question. People taking notes. Yes.
Oh, okay, I have a question for Jeff, actually. I think it was a point you made about Egypt, and talked about how, like, for the U.S.-backed coup in Egypt to put in kind of the military dictatorship back in power. It was already in power, but to take out a democratically elected leader, being Morsi. I guess I was having some, like, skepticism about the role that neoliberalism has played in the Muslim Brotherhood, and how kind of, you know, Morsi was going to accept like a $5 billion loan from the U.S. I'm just curious of how that plays in, because the U.S. will say one thing, like they condemned the coup, but then they still back the military with billions of dollars. So I'm just kind of confused on that. I guess the role of, like, capitalist Western powers and propping up either side at any given moment.
Okay, why don't we have a couple more, then have some of our panelists respond.
Yes. I want to ask about the U.S. discourse of counterterrorism, which of course has a long history. I want to ask what's new. As everybody here will know and remember, perhaps back in the 70s and 80s, this term was thrown at potentially any resistance to U.S. imperialism around the world. But since 9/11, it's become more pervasive and perhaps even more differentiated. And it's being increasingly thrown at various forces in Africa to justify the extension of U.S. military presence and alliances with regimes there. And in various ways, it justifies state terror. It also creates new kinds of instabilities. I mean, we all know about blowback from 9/11, but there are local blowbacks, including Syria. So I wanted to ask, how do we now understand this much more differentiated strategy of global counterterror, and how, it's easy to be satirical about it.
Can we
But
leave it at that?
how do we analyze this for the purpose of trying to delegitimize U.S. intervention throughout the world?
Thank you. Woman Becker.
I don't understand how the U.S. can, with a straight face, be against self-determination. I mean, Crimea was part of Russia for hundreds of years. They speak Russian. The majority of the people living there wanted to be part of Russia. Germany, there were two Germanys after World War II for many decades, and we lived with that. I think it's obvious that Ukraine, which is the largest country in Europe, should be split in two and have a West Ukraine and an East Ukraine. And I don't understand why we don't push for a real democratic plebiscite of the people who live in this area. I don't think East Ukraine and West Ukraine should be forced to be one country.
We're going to have some response.
Can I take a few more?
Let's just have a response now, and then I said we would have.
Yeah, a good question. In Egypt, there were 3 candidates in the first election, and the second candidate lost. No one got a majority, so they did a runoff between Morsi and the military's candidacy, and Morsi won. And Morsi is the head of the Muslim Brotherhood that had been given a certain dispensation under the military dictatorship. It was allowed to function economically within limits. It had its own layer of multimillionaire and billionaires. And there were 2 aspects to it that are critical to understand. The first is that as a pro-capitalist formation, it had no way that it could implement the needs of the Egyptian people, although some foolish people on the left called Morsi the right wing of the Egyptian revolution. That is, he was part of a revolutionary process. So Morsi did nothing. He refused to pass a trade union law. But it did nothing to infringe on capitalism's rights. But at the same time, the United States, which was shocked that its military candidate was not elected, essentially huddled with the military and said, give us a year and we'll discredit him. And that they did. So, for example, all the IMF loans that he applied for had massive strings attached, which would have required him to implement even more austerity than before. Plus, the military, which controlled 40% of the economy, essentially cut off the fuel supply, cut off food supplies, cut off water supplies to Cairo in order to fuel the discontent in the country, and blamed it on Morsi. So Morsi had 2 contradictions. One, he was being undermined by the real power that controlled 40% of the economy, by the world banking system that refused to grant him loans other than those that would be required to undermine his own state. And that's why he became unpopular. And the United States and the military used that to mobilize innocent people, but others, all the bourgeois opposition parties and pro-military parties were the ones that mobilized on June 30th. Okay, the second question is on the Ukraine, on Crimea. They had 85% of the people voted in the Crimean referendum. There was one person dead in the entire takeover. The entire army of Ukraine in Crimea went over to the Russians, but mostly by fraternization, and they voted 97% to leave. That was one aspect, but they did that because they understood that there was a neo-fascist-led coup, that they were subject to austerity, that they received letters in the Ukraine saying that their houses were going to be taken over by Svoboda troops who were going to come into the country, and anyone resisted would be met with violence. So they left. But there are other aspects to the Crimea. One is that the Russians that now annexed it with the support of this referendum have said control 26,000 square miles of offshore rights, which is rich to the tune of trillions of dollars of offshore oil. And they're very concerned with that, and so was the United States oil companies. So the Russians now have control of those offshore resources. In my opinion, the Russians are not good guys in the sense that they have any interest in advancing the Ukrainian people's interest. They, Putin, supported the May 25th referendum in the Ukraine. They asked the people in eastern and southern Ukraine to call off their elections. They are a process of constant negotiation between the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov and Kerry on how to negotiate a solution. And the solution is to maintain some of the Russian interests in the country in the east, including manufacturing and fracking and oil and so on, and have some form of greater autonomy in order to maintain Russian capitalist interests in the country. And that's what's being negotiated behind the backs of the people. What's missing in the Ukraine is a party that fights for the interests of the working class itself. A mass revolutionary socialist party that is independent of and opposition to the oligarchs, whether they be Russian or former Russian, in the Ukraine. None of whom, both of those groups are more than willing to collaborate with U.S. imperialism or the Russian capitalist state. So that's the main thing that's missing there. And finally, on your question, today the war on terror is a even more vicious form of the anti-communist crusades of the McCarthy era. You mentioned terror, and it justifies the sending of U.S. troops anywhere. Invasions and demonization of every single country. Africa is being recolonized. And I use the word cautiously because it was never fully decolonized, in the sense that although they put a black mask on the white face of the previous imperialist nations throughout Africa, they were still under imperial economic control. The former countries did that. So today the United States is trying to recolonize it against the interests of its competitors in France and elsewhere. Nigeria is oil rich. Libya has 4% of the oil in the world, and that's why they went into that country. Libya was liberated, Tripoli, by Qatar, but Qatar has no army. Qatar has a literally Blackwater privatized US funded army that marched its troops to supposedly liberate the country after they destroyed the whole thing. In Iraq and Libya and so on,
let's hear from someone.
let me just finish the sentence. If you look at the fine print of every one of the oil agreements, I mean the fine print, it's the basic US corporations that control those oils. Even though they say in Iraq it went to Britain, it went to France, it went to this, the fine print say that the real wealth of those countries is in the hands of American imperialist oil corporations, the most powerful and the richest in the world. The United States didn't spend billions and kill 1.5 million Iraqis in order to give the oil democratically to their capitalist competitors, believe me.
Are there other panelists who'd like to respond to this? Okay, we'll
I'd
take.
like to hear some more questions.
We're going to take questions now. Okay.
Yeah.
Who would like to ask questions? Yeah.
I came in late, so you may have addressed this earlier. My question, and it's actually two questions. It's the first part of it is how do we re-energize and regain the spirit and the legacy of the African American people as being hugely anti-war, anti-imperialist, and because you talked about the new face of the empire, so I missed that, and from where I stand, the new face is something that has been very paralyzing. So fast forwarding, when we have a commander-in-chief who has genitalia that is different from the 46 predecessors or 45, how do we deal with that? So how do we, because again, people are going to be paralyzed. The females, Hillary or whatever she.
Further questions? Yeah.
There were 600 American troops that landed in Sicily last month. 4 days before a dissident General Hifter in Libya decided to lead a coup, a so-called coup. And it indicates to me this is part of that same covert strategy, because you could believe in a law of perpetual coincidences. But General Hifter lived in North Virginia, right near a certain headquarters of a certain agency called the CIA. This is the covert face, as you're saying, of American imperialism. I think, and with Boko Haram, it's interesting that they fought in Mali and received training and arms from weaponry that was being sent down from Libya into Mali. So the interconnections are all there. We have to point those things out. I think two things. We have an absolute decline in the anti-war movement since 2008, and that's not coincidental. I think one of the reasons is what you're saying here with the covert wars and the style. People aren't immediately affected and don't immediately see it. And also, I think there was massive illusions in Obama that demobilized any kind of anti-war movement. Those two things kind of dovetail.
I think most of us here have read or reviewed the same resources and references. Somewhat with Sara Flounders and more with Jeff. I mean, we can conceptualize the plans that have been put in place with Egypt, the overthrow of the coup, with capitalizing and monopolizing oils. And I think most people who read the same references and resources would agree that these plans are radical, profound. But I think what you're suggesting or hinting at is that they've succeeded, that they have monopolized, they have installed a puppet regime within Syria, within Egypt. And I think that's a vast leap of the kind of capabilities and abilities of the United States administration to say that we conceptualize their plans, but isn't that kind of a big leap saying that they've actually succeeded in those plans?
Those are my questions.
Would you care to comment about the recent speech by Obama at West Point, in the sense of, are we looking at something qualitatively different, or, as was mentioned in the panel, something progressive escalation, destabilization? I don't know.
Okay. That should wrap us up. So go ahead.
Go from this direction.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on a few of the questions briefly. The brother here who asked about the historic role of African Americans in opposing war, but not only war, but also all forms of social injustice inside the United States. And I think the presence of the Barack Obama administration, in a way, has put serious impediments to that traditional anti-war sentiment in the African American community. There is a reluctance, particularly on the part of certain political segments inside the United States, to actually oppose the president. I mean, there's a rationale that says that if we lean too hard on the president, that it will of course, bolster the right wing, whose approach is fundamentally racist towards the president. His fundamental foreign policy is really no different than previous presidents. The Bush administration, for example, the United States Africa Command was initiated under the George Bush administration in early 2008. It had wide opposition on the African continent, but at the same time, under Obama, it has been strengthened and enhanced. There are more U.S. Special Forces, more drones, more CIA and State Department personnel right now operating in Africa than there were under the Bush administration. So I think this is something that we have to deal with honestly. And not only the African American community, but other communities inside the United States have also, to a certain extent, been paralyzed by the Obama administration, which fundamentally is carrying on the same imperialist agenda. And also the same domestic agenda in terms of austerity and political repression against the people of color communities and also working class and poor people in general. Poverty is going up. Actual unemployment is going up in the United States. Those figures they put out every month about the jobless rate really don't take into account that the labor participation rate inside the United States has declined drastically, even under a Democratic administration. The question of the role of Khalifa Haftar, he has been a CIA operative for well over 30 years. So his involvement in Libya, he was flown back there at the beginning of the counter-revolution in February and March of 2011. And of course, the United States, of course, has a role in what's going on right now. They could stop him tomorrow if they wanted to, because he has worked for them for many, many years. And they are, in the process, we found out a few days ago, mobilizing at least 1,000 troops to possibly evacuate U.S. citizens or being involved in some type of aerial bombardment of forces that they had worked with previously. These same so-called al-Qaeda elements, like the Islamic Fighting Group and others, served as the ground troops during the Pentagon NATO bombing in 2011. And they can strike against them if they want to. The question of Boko Haram, I think it's complex, because on the one hand, it does reflect the tradition, well, I won't say traditional, but the regional fracturing of Nigeria that was instituted as a result of the legacy of British colonialism in West Africa, the whole process of indirect rule, where they allowed people from the north to predominate in the military, people from the south, certain groups were given higher degrees of Western education, were able to enter the civil service, people in the West, of course, being heavily involved in the commercial sector of the economy. So they, as Jeff pointed out, and Sara as well, they manipulate these regional differences, which are an outgrowth of the post-colonial process, in order to destabilize these countries and, of course, justify and provide a rationale for U.S. military intervention. The whole question of Nigeria having the largest economy in Africa has to be looked at very skeptically. There's mass poverty there. There's joblessness there. The infrastructure has not been built up, despite the fact that you have billions and billions of dollars being generated in oil revenue every single quarter. I mean, Nigeria has some of the most high-grade crude oil in the world. And that's what the U.S. wants to control. Plus, China, several years ago, signed some agreements with the Nigerian government to develop refineries and other forms of modernization in the Nigerian oil sector. And they, of course, want to block Chinese intervention as well. And finally, the Obama speech the other day at West Point, in my opinion, it really represents no fundamental shift in the overall imperialist outlook of the United States. He says, oh, we're bringing the troops home, but at the same time, 10,000 U.S. troops are still going to be on the ground in Afghanistan. They still have these mercenaries who are there that are financed indirectly through U.S. taxpayer dollars. So basically, there's really no fundamental difference between this. And of course, they engineered the destabilization of Ukraine. They're threatening war against Russia. And in other parts of the world, like Syria, Latin America, there's constant destabilization taking place. So personally, I don't see any fundamental difference. Maybe a difference in the rhetoric, but the practice is the same. And it's just as dangerous today as it was 20 years ago in terms of threats against China, against Russia, against countries in Latin America, and so forth.
I'm just going to jump out of protocol and say I disagree. I think it's a tremendous escalation. You know, W didn't have this many wars going. The super surveillance state has been escalated.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah,
I agree. There is an escalation.
That's all I want to say.
In terms of the African continent, Russia, China, yes, I agree. But it follows the same trajectory.
Yeah.
And it's clearly related to the worsening economic crisis that exists in this country and internationally. We see what's being imposed in Southern Europe. The austerity, the same type of austerity that they're imposing in Detroit, where I'm from. A tax on pensions, privatization of public assets, driving down wages and so forth. So we don't disagree.
Yeah, there is an escalation regardless of who's in the White House, because their situation is more and more untenable. And just to particularly focus on the man in the back who asked a question, this is not in any way a done deal. Not one of these plans and not one of these wars has succeeded in their aim. As a matter of fact, every one of them has been a disaster. The U.S. really assumed they could walk into Iraq and take over. There was no military left. The country had been starved down to nothing, completely dislocated, and they literally did have to pull out. It did not go according to plan at all. Afghanistan, the poorest country in the world at the time, and no government to speak of, and yet more than 10 years later, here they are still unable to stabilize their situation. Libya, it seemed easy after just destroying every city from the water system to the electricity, and they have not been able. So not one of these wars are succeeding.
Yeah, but who controls the assets of those places you just mentioned?
Well, that was why I went back to Goldfinger. If they can control it, they want to take it off the market totally and destroy it. And that is what has happened in many of these countries. If they can't, and while at the same time allocating huge money in the name of our money from right here in the U.S., it goes to private contractors, huge corporations, on rebuilding programs that are just handouts. But I want to address also, in terms of Egypt, with everything that the Muslim Brotherhood may have been willing to make and sign, all kinds of arrangements and deals, didn't see themselves as a revolutionary anti-capitalist force. They had a very different agenda. But nevertheless, the U.S. is threatened by any popular-based movement in the world, and any move for self-determination, unless it's a totally staged and manufactured thing like in South